Let's start in English. So welcome everyone to the history of British Airways. My name is Madeleine Solomons, and as Olivier said, I currently teach English at ENAC. I love aviation history, and I used to be a flight attendant, not for British Airways because I was too small. I went to the interview and I was 1 centimetre too small. So I never flew for them. So today for British Airways, we will be talking about the origins of British Airways. Here I just put a passenger ticket as we're going to start our trip today. So we'll be talking about the origins of British Airways all the way back to 1919. So the first part today will cover the Civil Aviation Act of 1919 to the Civil Aviation Act of 1971. And I'm going to talk about the airlines that helped shape British Airways as we know it today. The second part will cover the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. How was the British Airways How was British Airways perceived in the 70s? How was the passenger experience? How was it set up? And then we'll obviously talk about Concorde and how British Airways evolved in the later part of the 20th century. And the third part will cover the early 2000s, basically up until Concorde was retired. And then we'll just look at the challenges it faced just then. So the three parts that I was talking about, so the origins of British Airways from We'll Take More Care of You to the world's favourite airline, and British Airways, the early 2000s. The origins. So it first started in 1919. So you maybe heard a few years ago in the news that it was the centennial of British Airways in 2019, all the way back to 1919. Now, British Airways was founded officially in 1974, but it traces its roots back to 1919 with aircraft transport and travel. And they actually operated the first regular international scheduled passenger flight between Hounslow Heath, an airport in the UK in London, all the way to Paris Le Bourget. And that was on the 25th of August, 1919. And that was the day of the Civil Aviation Act of 1919, which basically allowed airlines to operate commercial flights again after the Great War. But what's interesting to know as well is there was a flight on the 15th of July 1919 between London and Le Bourget, but it wasn't necessarily backed by the British government. And the reason they did that is because aircraft transport and travel had been ready to fly since the 15th of November 1918. So they were in theory restricted until the Civil Aviation Act of 1919. So there was the official flight on the 25th of August 1919, the first regular scheduled passenger, international passenger flight, and 15th of July 1919, the first flight. And then on the 10th of November 1919 was the first international airmail flight from London to Paris Le Bourget by aircraft transport and travel. Now, this airline didn't last that long. They ceased operations in 1921, and it was incorporated into Daimler Airway Limited, which was then part of Imperial Airways. And it's important to know that 1919 was a significant year for the development of civil aviation and air transport. Another very important airline is Imperial Airways. So I've already talked about it previously. Imperial Airways was founded on the 31st of March 1924, and they ceased operations in 1939. 4 airlines played a part in the creation of Imperial Airways. That was the British Marine Air Navigation Limited, and Instone Airline, Daimler Airway Limited. So AT&T became part of Daimler Air Limited, and Hanley Page Transport Limited. So those 4 airlines were part of Imperial Airways. Now, Imperial Airways was created to facilitate overseas settlement, so it could create easier flights and transport to the British Empire and back. And that's why and how Imperial Airways was created. So you can see here the pictures, you can see on the right, Imperial Airways, all the different routes. So you can see that they're really covering practically the whole world with the different routes that they operate. And some of them were operated in association with other airlines. Back then, to fly, for example, from Croydon Airport, so that was Imperial Airways base, was Croydon Airport. If you wanted to fly to Australia, it would take you about 10 days to get there. So 10 days from London to Australia. I'm not going to do the whole presentation on Imperial Airways, so just another interesting fact. On the 1st of May 1927, Imperial Airways introduced its Silver Wing service from London to Paris, and it was the first luxury in-flight service. And all their ads here are really about comfort and reliability and reassuring passengers when they go on these flights, because back then aviation was relatively new. You had to be quite brave to get on board. So another airline that's part of British Airways history, and you have here British Airways Limited. So it's not to be confused with the British Airways that we know today. British Airways Limited was its own separate company that operated from 1935 to 1939. And you can see here British Airways, you can see an ad for it on the left. And then you can also see British Airways aircraft here, and this is Gatwick Airport, I believe, not mistaken. So that's for British Airways Limited, who ceased operations in 1939, so a short-lived British airline. Then we go on to BOAC, so I've talked about that, so that's British Overseas Airways Corporation. So BOAC, so they were founded on the 24th of November 1939, and BOAC is basically Imperial Airways and British Airways Limited, and they created BOAC. You can see here on the posters, we've got BOAC takes good care of you. So this was more in the 50s, and this was from the early 70s, this picture on your left with the 2 flight attendants. And those were the new sort of space age uniforms that they're wearing. I talk about that in the BOAC presentation. So BOAC was one of the airlines that made British Airways. Then we go on to London Airport. So I thought it was interesting to talk about London Airport because that was BOAC's base in 1946. And this is when it opened after the Second World War. So you can see that the outside part, if you look on the right, you can see that it's literally just tents. You can see the post box, the telephone boxes, the little post office part here, but it's completely different to the way we know it today. Now, London Airport has now become Heathrow, but when BOAC was operating at the start, you would call it London Airport. And then you can see the inside on the left. And what I find really interesting is you can see W.H. Smith, and you still got that today in Heathrow Airport. So this is the inside of it. It officially became Heathrow Airport in 1966. Then we go on to another airline called BEA. So that is British European Airways. BOAC was the overseas division for British Airlines. BEA was the European division. So they'd sort of organized it that way. So here we have BA Viscount, one of the aircraft that BA used to operate. And then here we have when in Europe, do as Europeans, fly BA, just ask Pan Am. So Pan Am was actually one of BOAC's main competitors. So here we have Europe's #1 airline. So that was BEA. It was founded on the 1st of January 1946, and they did short to medium haul flights. So now that I've talked about all of the airlines that existed before British Airways, but actually helped it shape the company that it is today. So in 1971, there was an act of parliament that actually merged BOAC and BEA together, effective on the 31st of March, 1974. And basically, it's formed what we know today as British Airways. And you can see here on the left, BOAC presents an airline that's even better than BOAC. And they decided to call it British Airways. So it's BOAC and Europe's leading airline, BEA. And you can see the Boeing 747 here. Now the world is yours. And then you have British Airways on it. So that is how British Airways came to exist. It wasn't just founded in 1974 from nothing. It's lots of different airlines that built it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go on to British Airways from "We'll take more care of you" to the world's favorite airline. So here we have British Airways, 1970s, that was the early days. It started in 1974. And what we have here is the newly created British Airways, and they have inherited the routes from BOAC and BEA. What I find quite interesting here is if you look at like the size of Europe, it's quite bigger here compared to like the US. But you can see all the different routes. So you've got all of the UK, all of Europe, you've got the US, you've even got down Australia down here. So here we have the route network in 1974, and this is one of the first leaflets that was handed out with this new network. What also happened was in the 1970s, British Airways didn't necessarily have, it wasn't necessarily beloved by the British. Some people disliked the service. There are some quotes of crew saying, oh, in the 70s, I didn't want to tell people I worked at BA because then they would complain and tell me how awful the airline was. So it wasn't, when it first started, the beloved airline or the world's best airline. So we can see that this is an advert from the 70s. We've got, "We'll take more care of you." So that sort of like follows the BOAC, "We'll take good care of you, we'll take more care of you." We've got, "It's nice to have you with us." So this person here is actually a real British Airways flight attendant from the 70s, and I went a little bit too quickly. So you can see a picture of her here as well. So she was a flight attendant, and she was actually moved to the Concorde service because when she was flying on regular flights, people were constantly asking her for autographs, and she felt quite embarrassed by this sudden fame. And she said she really enjoyed working on Concorde because everyone else flying the plane was more famous than her. And her name was Rosalind, and then she became a TV presenter in the UK and then retrained as a nurse. So that's for that little story. So now that I'm here on Concorde, so the 70s for British Airways also saw the introduction of the most, some would say, iconic aircraft, Concorde. So just a brief description. So Concorde was jointly manufactured by Sud Aviation, later Aerospatiale, and British Aircraft Corporation. 20 aircraft were built, 6 prototypes and development aircraft, including them. And in the end, Air France and British Airways were the only customers, were the only operators of Concorde. Just for the little anecdote, so even numbered aircraft were assembled at Filton, while odd numbers were assembled at Toulouse. On the 21st of January 1976, the first passenger supersonic service were inaugurated, and British Airways flew to Bahrain, so Concorde, so it's the Golf, Bravo, Oscar, Alpha, Alpha. That was one that flew to Bahrain, and Air France simultaneously at the same time flew to Rio de Janeiro via Dakar. So that was the first Concorde flight. In the 1980s, British Airways regarded Concorde as its sort of like flagship aircraft. It was very prestigious and it was very profitable then. And you can see the we care, who cares enough to make the world half as big by flying twice as fast, because obviously it flew twice as fast. There we go for Concorde. So we'll go on to the next page. So here we're talking about Boeing 747. British Airways, they would call Boeing 747 the Queen of the Skies. It was one of the most, some people would say, transformative aircraft. It was a long-haul aircraft. They'd never seen that in those days, an aircraft that could transport so many passengers. And that also opened the door for British Airways to introduce a new class on their aircraft. So if you look on the left of the screen, you can see, are you taking advantage of the change in the class system? So most airlines those days would offer first class and economy, but what British Airways did is they introduced first class, club and economy. And that was in May 1977. They introduced an executive club cabin on its Boeing 747 flights to New York. And the relatively large size of the aircraft allowed the introduction of these new cabins. So you can see that they're trying to attract more businessmen. You can see that air traffic is really, there are more and more travelers. And you can see that they're trying to attract more people as well. So people with the club, with the executive club, have their own check-in desks. They can enjoy the comforts of the club cabin. They have free drinks, hot towels. So they're really trying to boost it with business travelers. So this is for the Boeing 747, Queen of the Skies, and the new executive club. Then I'll briefly talk about British Airways helicopters. That's something that I found out when I was doing research, that British Airways actually had a small helicopter division. It actually started with BEA, so British European Airlines, and I talked about that previously. And what was interesting is British Airways helicopters was part of the Airlink high frequency helicopter shuttle service. And that was between Gatwick and Heathrow Airport. And that was in 1978. So you would have a little shuttle link with a helicopter between Heathrow and Gatwick. And then they would also fly to the other British Isles. So you can see here, Penzance Heliport, fly to the Isles of Scilly in 20 minutes with helicopters. So you would actually have British Airways crew on board these helicopters. And it was actually, they stopped operating these helicopters in 1986 when that division was sold. So next we will go on to the shuttle. So the shuttle, that's something that I think is quite very interesting and good. So basically the shuttle was introduced in 1975. It was introduced on routes to Glasgow, to Edinburgh, to Manchester. And you would fly from Heathrow from London. And what you could do is you could turn up at the airport 10 minutes before a flight, and you would literally say, I want to fly from Heathrow to Glasgow. And you could go on the plane. You would go on the plane straight away. So 10 minutes before departure, you would turn up. You would get on the plane. You would pay for your flight on the plane. and then you would go and you would be guaranteed a seat. So you could turn up with no ticket 10 minutes before the flight and you would be guaranteed a seat. And if the aircraft was full, they would have a second plane on standby. So they could then fly the extra passengers there. And rumor has it, they actually flew 2 planes up there once because 2 extra people wanted to board and the aircraft was full. So on these sort of flights, it was basic though. You would turn up 10 minutes before, but you wouldn't have any complimentary drinks. You wouldn't have any meals, hot meals, anything of that. You would literally turn up 10 minutes before, get on the plane and go. But you can see there were lots of flights throughout the day. It started at 7:15 in the morning and the last one would leave at 8:15. So again, they were trying to sell that to business travelers who could, if you were living in Glasgow, you could catch a flight in the morning, go to your meeting and then come back and you wouldn't have to book and you could just go. So that was launched in 1975. BA did want to extend this shuttle service to different places, such as Paris. But after talking to the authorities and Air France, BA was not allowed, British Airways was not allowed to do that. So they only kept that in Great Britain. So that's for the shuttle. Then next we're going to, so that was for the 70s. Now we're going to talk about the 1980s. So a decade of change for British Airways. So in 1979, a Conservative government was elected and they declared basically that British Airways wouldn't receive any state support and they didn't want to interfere with its decision making. So that was in 1979. So 1980, decade of change. And the 1980s for British Airways sees new advertising, new management. You'll see also they use the word super quite a lot. So here we have, I just chose this picture because it's a very 1980s ad that you can see here. So then we'll go on to the next page. So British and proud of it. So this was introduced in 1980, in June 1980, and British Airways decided that they wanted to abbreviate the name from British Airways to British. And but it didn't really work out, so it didn't last long. Outside of the UK, people thought it was too nationalistic, and it just didn't work. So British didn't last long, and it went back to British Airways. And you can see here one of the rare sort of ads where you can see British and proud of it, British Airways. Next, we go on to the world's favorite airlines. So I was talking about like new advertising. They started this new promotional campaign with a very famous advertising agency, Saatchi & Saatchi in the UK. And they claimed to be the world's favorite airline, one of the most powerful airlines. And they used these slogans between 1983 and 2001. So you can see here, everything leaves here from the centre, from the UK, all around the world. Then we go on to Super Club in 1981. So I was talking about the different type of advertising. So we're back onto the same advert that I showed you previously. So Super Club is the widest seat in business class in 1981. And they would have Super Club flights to the US, and it was their business class cabin. And basically the seats were a lot wider, you had more room for your arms, and you were generally more comfortable. And British Airways was selling it as the best thing they have on their planes, and it was better than other business classes on other aircraft and other airlines. So what's interesting here is you're starting to see the rebranding for British Airways. So here, if you look on the bottom right, you can see British Airways. So this was the logo that ran from the start of British Airways in 1974 to 1984. And then in 1984, they switched to a different logo that had the line just here on the left, and it had British Airways. So here you can see the Super Club tag. So this is clearly after 1984, but they're starting their big rebrand. So that's Super Club. Then we go on to the Super Shuttle. So the Super Shuttle is basically the shuttle that I was talking about previously. But the Super Shuttle, what they did is they provided hot meals, which is what the normal shuttle didn't provide. They didn't provide food service. They would provide champagne on here. What was interesting as well with the Super Shuttle is to launch the Super Shuttle in 1983. I think it was the 30th of August, 1983. They did a one-off flight with Concorde from Heathrow to Glasgow in Scotland. So to launch the Super Shuttle, they had the Super Concorde do it. And you can see here that they're showing the Super Shuttle. You've got the champagne apparently fueling the aircraft, and they've already had 2 million people flying on it in this advert in 1984. So that was the, and the reason they also launched the Super Shuttle is they wanted to rival BMI, so British Midland. But British Midland did have their loyal passengers as well, who kind of rejected the idea of BA and wanted to keep on flying with this other independent airline. So that was for the Super Shuttle. Now, here we have we have other images. So you can see here the logo for British Airways has changed. This is the new one. You can see that here on the right, you've got Domestic Airline of the Year. So they're improving their customer service, and they want to show passengers that they are improving. And then here you've got the Edinburgh schedule. So you've got the frequencies, excluding Sunday, excluding Saturday, Sunday. So it's mainly a weekly one. Here you've got daily flights at 11, at 3 o'clock. And you can also see on this card that check-in at Shuttlegate up to 10 minutes before departure. So you can turn up 10 minutes before the plane needs to leave with no ticket, and you will have a 5-star hot breakfast on departures in the morning, free bar on all services, free newspapers, and you can pay for your ticket in the plane. So next, what we'll go, so here's the new logo that I was talking about. So introduced in 1984, and they stopped using it in 1997. Then in the 80s, we come to putting people first. So putting people first is was created by a Danish firm, and it was introduced, sorry, a minute. So putting people first. So that was created by a Danish firm. And it was for British Airways employees in the early 80s. And the aim of this, it was a 2-day training course. And it was here to motivate staff, to help them understand what good customer service is, to how to really effectively talk to passengers, how to manage stress, how to interact with passengers, and basically sort of try to change the image that they had or how some perceived it in the 70s. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to turn British Airways image around. And they even had training programs for managers as well, which was called Managing People First. So we've got putting people first for like cabin crew, frontline BA employees. And then we've got putting managers, managing people first for the managers. And what they did in 1985 is they launched Supercare. So Supercare was a TV advertising campaign. What they would show is they would show British Airways employees doing amazing things. There's one advert where an air steward gets out, there's a crash on a motorway, loads of footballs go everywhere and stop the cars. And 2 passengers say, we're not going to be able to make our British Airways flight. So the steward gets his uniform on and then picks up all the footballs in a record time, and the passengers are able to get onto their plane. So they're I'm not sure how, if it's aged quite well, but it was adverts from the 80s showing crew doing amazing things, showing that they're going above and beyond for their passengers, and showing them that they're really trying to assist them in extraordinary ways. So again, trying to change the image of it. And then you can see here on the picture, the British Concorde attitude, you'll find it at every altitude. So here you've got a Boeing 747, and then you've got the Concorde just above. So again, in this advert, you can see that they're talking about courtesy, good manners, genuine concern for comfort, and they really want to people to experience the best of passenger experience, whether you're on the Concorde or on a different British Airways plane. So then 1987. So this is the privatization of British Airways, and you can see here in British Airways News, so the weekly newspaper for British Airways staff, you can see shares for sale in the UK at 125 pence each. And this came out, as you can see, on Friday, January 30th, 1987. And you can see shares in British Airways are now on offer to the UK public and eligible members of the airline staff. And 720 million shares being sold, and offer closes in a week. So they've got a week to buy their shares. So that's when British Airways is privatized. A year later, they will buy British Caledonian. So British Caledonian, that was known as Britain's second airline after British Airways. And they took over this airline. But British Caledonian air stewardesses after the takeover could still wear their uniforms here with different Scottish tartan, and each flight attendant could choose the uniform that they wanted to wear out of a different fabric and different patterns. And here you can see all the different British Caledonian aircraft. They operated quite a lot from Gatwick. So when British Airways incorporated British Caledonian, they also got the Gatwick airport as well. So that's for 1988. Then we come into the 1990s. So in the 1990s, there was a Gulf War, and British Airways lost a lot of passengers, and traffic plummeted then. And they were trying to find a way of reviving the airline. So in 1991, in March 1991, what they decided to do was the world's biggest offer. They wanted to give away every single available seat on the airline's international services on the 23rd of April. So it was basically around 50,000 free tickets. And you could apply at BA ticket offices, or you could through newspaper entry forms. So that was something quite amazing, and they kept it under wraps. No one knew about it. The advertising agency that had booked all of the slots in the different newspapers and magazines just said it was some normal British Airways ad. They'd sent the ad off already, and then at the last minute sent in the new one. So no one knew about this big offer that was going to happen. And it even worked on Concorde. So you could even get a free ticket on a British Airways Concorde. So following on from the 90s, so we had increased competition. So there was increased competition with British Airways among American Airlines, United Airlines, Pan Am, Virgin Atlantic that we have here. There's always been quite a big competition between British Airways and Virgin Atlantic. Here we have one of the sort of like funny sort of like ads, like Virgin Atlantic is trying to wind British Airways up. So you've got BA, play of word, I won't say the word out loud, but BA don't give a shiatsu. So here on the upper class, so first class in Virgin Atlantic, they are giving out free onboard massages So massages. So they're showing that they care more about their customers. They've got something extra, and obviously play of words. So you have these massive billboards bust around in around I think this came out in 1993. Virgin Atlantic also so they, and it's justified, they claim that they have, they were one of the first with seat back TVs. And they were really, Virgin liked to play on the fact that they were the first with like extra fun touches for passengers. So they would give ice creams on board, and it was free ice creams when you got in, and they were doing massages, and they had, at one point they had like hairdressers on board and beauticians. So they had all these like fun extras that British Airways wasn't offering on their planes. And Virgin likes to claim that they were the first airline to offer seatback TV to all passengers from June 1991. And it was really after 1987, when British Airways was privatized, that Richard Branson really began to become one of the main competitors of British Airways. Another competitor of British Airways as well that was developing, that was just starting out in the 1990s, was Easyjet. Now, Easyjet started with its first flight from London Luton to Glasgow on the 10th of November 1995. So this was the Boeing, the aircraft that did the first flight. And you can see that it was just at the start of internet. So they didn't have the easyjet.com on the side of the fuselage on the aircraft. They had the phone number that you could phone up to book your tickets. So they were using, Easyjet was using the fuselage of the aircraft as advertising, so people would see it and could phone up. And this is really the beginning of the battle between BA, British Airways, and low-cost airlines, and trying to compete with them. So that was in 1995. Then we're going to talk about cabin innovations. So in the early 90s, also then British Airways brought in the seatback TV for the first time. Also the flatbed as well that you've got here. So a sort of bed that you can lie down and be a little bit more comfortable in first class. And then in 1996, you can see here on the right, so this is the cradle seat from 1996. So you had a little bit more room to push back and you could be more comfortable. So that's 1996. Then we've got a new logo, 1997 to today. So this is the logo, this is British Airways as we know it today. So now we're coming towards the end of the presentation. So British Airways, the early 2000s. So the early 2000s sees the introduction of the World Traveller Plus. So World Traveller Plus is basically the premium economy cabin. Now, British Airways wasn't the first airline to do so. That was Virgin Atlantic, again, Virgin adding these extras. So BA launched World Traveller Plus in October 2000. And basically it took the number of classes on long-haul aircraft on a Boeing 747 to 4. The aim of the World Traveller Plus wasn't to bring sort of like the business customers down, it was to bring the world travellers up. Some people loved it, thought it's worth paying a little bit more to have more leg room. Some people said, no, actually, I'd rather just keep my money and spend it elsewhere. But the aim was to bring people up from World Traveller. Then there were some route closures, obviously, after 2001, 9/11. The most terrible year for the aviation industry. There were lots of route closures from British Airways, and there are too many actually to list. You could probably do a whole presentation on British Airways route closures actually from probably the 2000s up until 2020, 2021, up until now. And it's quite interesting to see which routes go. Some of the routes, British Airways stopped operating them directly, and it was local airlines that picked it up. Some routes were just completely cancelled. But you could see quite a lot of route closures. But let's not just stay on route closures. Let's go on to something a little bit more fun. So the sleeper service, that was introduced in the early 2000s. And when I was reading about it and looking at the sleeper service and looking at all the different information there was, what I thought really interesting is that they're presenting it as you will basically dine before your flight in the lounges, in the British Airways lounge. So you will eat and then you'll get straight on the plane and you'll go to sleep. And it's a little bit how BOAC used to sell their sleeper service as well. Back in the 1950s, when you would fly from London to the United States, the Stratocruisers were these big aircraft, and you could get a good night's 7 hours sleep on these planes and then wake up to a nice breakfast. And basically, this is what British Airways is doing here with the sleeper service. So you can see on the left, you can see the man is going to sleep in Times Square in New York, the passenger, and then he's waking up in London. So the sleeper service was introduced on relatively short, long-haul distances from the US, so East Coast, obviously, and the Middle East, and they were all to Heathrow. And what they would do on these flights is they would minimize cabin service, they would dim the lights, and they would make it so you could have a pleasant night's sleep. So that's for the sleeper service. And then just going on to the last one, so Concorde. So Concorde was retired in 2003, the end of an era. Concorde was in commercial service in British Airways from 1976 to 2003. It was one of the greatest design icons. It was the world's, well, only supersonic aircraft to be used commercially for so long. And then it flew at twice the speed of sound. It flew at 60,000 feet. It was first grounded in 2000 after the Paris Air Show, so at Le Bourget, and it had its airworthiness certificate withdrawn. It returned to commercial service in November 2001, and then the last flight was on the 24th of October 2003 for British Airways. So that's how I've decided to end this history of British Airways. Might carry on with a second part of really the 2000s, but for this presentation, this is it. So thank you very much.